Hi, everybody. My name is Laurie. I am with thewifeexpert.com. I am so grateful you guys keep coming back to my channel. And if you could, please subscribe to me. Hit the icon below that says subscribe, and then also hit the bell icon, which will make you notified when I put up new content, which is what I want. I want people to keep coming back here and then sharing it. Share this with your friends. Share this with family. Anyone that you know is struggling in marriage. This is not rocket science. This is all about knowing what to do and taking the steps to do it right. Because there's a right way and there's a wrong way. And most of us do it wrong until we go, let's get it right. So today I've got a guy coming on here who I'll tell you the story once he comes on. But he is world renowned. And it's an accident that I even connected with him. But I'm going to read about him. Ready? So Andrew G. Marshall is the United Kingdom's best known marital therapist and an expert on why people fall out of love and how to save your relationship. His work has been translated into 20 different languages, and his U.S. edition of I Love You, But I'm Not in Love with You was the very first book I bought in 2012 when my husband delivered those lines to me. So I know, I didn't know that when I found him. Anyway, as many of you know, my husband is home now and things with us are great, but they're not perfect, but they're great because nothing is ever perfect. Andrew has a ton of other books that I know you all will all love, and I want him to come on here and talk about it. So he's also written this book called Midlife Crisis is an Opportunity. And also, can we start over again, please? It's great. And I'm saying these titles wrong because I'm trying to blow through this because I know he's waiting. So anyway, I'm going to bring him on right now. He's got 30 years of practical experience doing therapy with couples and individuals on this subject. Brilliant. I can't wait to talk to him. Okay, let me bring him on. Andrew, hi. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you.
You look like a fun therapist to work with.
Thank you.
I love it. Listen, I need to tell you something.
Yep.
So I believe in God. Do you believe in God?
Yes.
Okay. So I believe I get messages, right? So sometimes in the middle of the night, something will wake me up. Something woke me up in the middle of the night, and the very first thing I saw was a title of one of your books. Because I was on my phone going, I got to go back to sleep. And then I dug into it, and I'm like, wow, this guy seems really interesting. He's doing books on topics that my people would love to know about. And so I reached out to you. And then later, and after we talked, I went back in and I saw that you wrote one of the books that I bought in 2012. And I bought it based on the words my husband told me. I love you, but I'm not in love with you. And
You
I
wouldn't
was
be
like,
the
wait,
first
what?
person who's heard that and bought the book.
Crazy. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, you're brilliant. That made me love you even more and be more excited that I was getting a chance to talk to you and bring you into my little place of amazing women and men who are just working their ass off to try to get their spouses back. And I can't say try, they are. Tell me about you and what got you started in therapy. You live in the UK.
No, I live in Germany. I moved about 6 years ago from the UK to Germany. One of the things I'd always wanted to do was experience a different culture. And the only way to experience a culture is to live there and learn the language.
Tell me about your work as a therapist, because it's very heavy. You've done a lot.
Would you believe 39 years sitting in a room listening to people's problems? Just extraordinary. When I first started, the reaction of my clients, because I worked for Relate, which is the UK's largest counselling charity, they sort of didn't know anything about you. They just came to see a Relate therapist. And they would always be shocked that, number one, I was a man, and number two, how young I was. I was younger than all of my clients. Now I'm older. In fact, I'm often old enough to be the parents of most of my clients. I've been doing it so long.
When you were younger, how did you get your knowledge? Was it just because you were studied, or was it because all of your books are along the same themes? And I'm assuming people came to you for other stuff, but all these books are about marriage.
Yes.
Being a good person. And
Something
how did that link click in your head?
I used to be on the radio. I suggested to the management at the radio station I worked in that we did a late night personal problem phone-in program. I got a set of experts who were going to come in and offer advice to people. And I was the host. My job was to ask them questions and draw them out, which actually I later discovered was at least 50% of the job of a therapist is drawing people out, getting them to talk, telling us what they really feel. And then I'd hand them over to the experts, and afterwards I would summarize the advice they've been given, and then they would either leave or go to our backup team. And actually summarizing what's been learnt in the session is probably another 20% of what people do. And everybody told me that I was really good at it. And early days, I think what actually made it possible for me to work with people, even though, I was a young therapist, was that I'm very good at helping people to communicate. That's the core of being a radio presenter, is communication. I was also trained as a journalist, so you're asking questions, being really curious, giving people space to talk to each other. That is incredibly important. When you actually make the decision that you're going to go and talk and you're going to sit together in a room with somebody else who's going to hold your coats and make certain one person doesn't get too much time and the other person doesn't retreat into the background. Once you've got that kind of courage, that is really powerful. Most therapists at the beginning at Relate, they would get through the waiting list in a huge amount of time because nobody came back. For some reason, they always came back with me. Why was this space so precious? Well, it's something I talk about on my podcast a lot. My parents would never talk about anything important. They felt that feelings were difficult things that were best pushed under the carpet. And obviously, I knew that that wasn't the case. I really needed to be in a space where you could talk openly and honestly about feelings. I think that's why I became a therapist. When I was growing up, we were a very close extended family. My grandmother would come to a local farm, which was run by another one of my cousins, every 3 weeks. So I was literally brought up with my cousins. This is the bit you have to understand. My mother's sister married my father's brother. Two sisters married two brothers. So normally, if there's a marital fallout, you stay with one side of the family, in other words, your own half of the family, and the in-laws, goodbye. That couldn't happen. And this was one of the world's worst divorce. I saw very close up how bad divorce was. One of the great myths is that divorce solves problems. It doesn't. You're just fighting, and instead of fighting in the same kitchen, you misunderstand. So what I always say is, whatever you're going to do when you come to see me, whether you're going to stay together or separate, I'm going to teach you these incredibly vital communication skills, because you're going to have to do the work of being able to speak to each other, negotiate and sort things out. If you've got children, if you haven't, it's quite easy to split. But if you've got children, there are 10 million things that need to be sorted out. And if you can't speak to each other when you're actually married, you're not, by getting divorced, miraculously going to be able to speak to each other better.
I'm going to be so much happier if I just divorce you.
Yeah, for 3 minutes. And by the time you get to the end of the drive, you would have thought, well, I felt good at saying it at that moment, but it's not going to be the solution. That is really difficult. That's why you need help and support. If you want a divorce, there's probably good reasons why you need a divorce. Let's sit down and talk about them. Let's hear about them. Let's see if there's something that can be saved, even if it's a friendship, even if it's being good co-parents together, because that is incredibly important for your children.
Do you think, from all the people that you've seen who've said, I want a divorce, how many of them really, in your opinion, should have gotten a divorce? You need to be divorced. Or some of it, how much do you really think should be? I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, I think, and there was one couple in 40 years that I said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not going to work with you anymore. They actually enjoyed hurting each other in my room. Even in my room, they couldn't actually stop, sticking the needle in, and they sort of knew exactly how to do it. Have you ever seen the film or seen the play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Yeah.
It was like actually being in that room. And I just said, look, you don't want to change. You just want to hurt each other. And I'm sorry, I'm too old to be sitting here listening to you do it. So I can't help you.
What happened? Did they leave or did they change?
Well, no, they I'm sure they're fighting in some other therapist's office now.
Okay. So the percentage is small of people who you actually think you need to get divorced.
Well, no, because sometimes I will be working with a couple and one person will say, look, I don't want to do this anymore, and they will go. And sometimes I will continue to work with the other person. But that was the only time when people were sitting in my office and I thought, well, actually, yeah, I think this would be better for the two of you, because this was a really toxic bond. But, it was obviously on some level working for them. It's just, I didn't want to be sitting in there with them.
So, but do you ever see, because I think in some of there's a couple books that you write about the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
Do you, obviously you believe and think this is true?
Yes. And I think we need to define what you mean by a midlife crisis.
Yeah, well, you go ahead and do it. Because that's why you're here. I want to hear what you say.
Okay, so what I mean by midlife crisis is we don't know how to be an adult when we're 16, 17. We just sort of follow what the big people do. We sort of think that if we study hard, we get a good job, we get married, and we do what parents, what society, what the church, what everybody else tells us is the right thing to do, our lives will be wonderful. If your husband has a midlife crisis, the most important thing to do is to actually listen to him. Don't try and convince him that he's wrong, that he's not having a crisis, because it's probably driven by something quite deep down inside. And it's probably not about you. It's probably stuff that's actually been building up for a very long time. Perhaps he's doing a job that isn't actually right for him. Perhaps he's not actually following the hobbies that he wants to do, that he actually finds it difficult to speak up and say what it is he really wants. They're very deep questions you have to ask yourself. Who am I? What makes my life meaningful? Which is one of the reasons why I've started a podcast called The Meaningful Life. And what are my values rather than my wife's values, my parents' values, everybody's values? Now, these are really difficult questions to answer. I've been working on who am I for the last 10, 15 years. And we don't like to deal with difficult questions, so we ask a really easy question like, do I fancy the woman who's sitting next to me? And we think that trying to resolve these deep-seated problems by a quick fix, like, find somebody else, it's not going to be the solution. But if you try and convince him of that, he's not going to listen to you. So you really have to listen to him. So when he says, my life is a misery and everything else like that, don't say, no, it isn't, and here are the reasons why not. You summarize what he's just said. So you're feeling that your life is a misery and you really nobody understands you. And just repeating back will get him to talk more and open up a little bit more. And you can then use the 3 most loving words in the English language, which are, tell me more. Why are they the 3 most loving words in the English language? Well, the reason they are is because he's going to tell you all sorts of things you don't want to hear. But if you can actually ask about them, he realizes that you're somebody who's going to listen to him rather than actually try and convince him he's wrong. And how often does convincing you that you're wrong work with you, Laurie? I don't think it probably does. But listening to you and helping you actually understand is something that's really important. So the midlife crisis is often thought about just fancying, wanting to be young again. But no, it's actually trying to connect with your authentic self. And to be honest, you want your authentic husband, not the miserable, grumpy person who's angry with everybody and is not. And the reason he's angry with everybody is not 99 times out of 100 just because of you. It's the easiest thing in the world for him to blame you. But it's often actually a whole load of other issues that he needs to address. But he's not going to address them if you're telling him he's wrong. So listen. These are the sort of skills I cover in this new course that I've put together, which is called My Best Relationship Tools. So I've put my 40 years worth of experience together, and these are the things that I use over and over again with couples. There is something called the drama triangle, and if you don't know about the drama triangle, you really do need to understand it, because particularly if there's another woman involved, that triangle is one that you'll go round over and over again. And I explain how to break the drama triangle and move into the winner's triangle. Now, in the drama triangle, which are victim, rescuer and persecutor, there are no good positions. But in the winner's triangle, they're all good positions. How do you move from the winner's triangle, from the drama triangle into the winner's triangle? You need the skills triangle. And I explain all the skills that you need to learn. One of which is reflecting back, which I've already taught you, which is instead of answering your partner, summarize what you've just heard and then ask them, is that right? Have I heard that correctly? And often they will say, well, yes, but you missed out X. And then you add that and then you ask them, is there more? Tell me more. And you really get him to open up. It's difficult to listen to the horrible things he's going to be saying, but it's much better for him to be saying them than just thinking them and you don't know what they are.
Right. So let's take a scenario, right? So a husband says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. I met someone else and I want to be married to you. How would you guide a woman to say, what words would you in that moment? She would say, wow, so I hear you and you're saying you don't want to be with me right now.
But this is not the first time. You know, the first time he says it, you're going to go, etc. But this isn't the first time he said it. It's the 399th millionth time he said it. So this time round, you don't have to explode. You have to say you don't want to be married to me, and you want to be married to somebody else. And he will then tell you a whole load of reasons why. And you just keep listening, and then he will say. There will come a point where you can say to him, do you want to hear things from my perspective? Once you've listened to him, he will listen to you much more. And most men are not as clear cut as that. Most men think they want to do this. They're not 100% certain.
Mm-hmm. They think they want to leave you, but they're not sure.
They're not sure because they're terrified they're making a big mistake. Because actually, if they were really 100% certain, they would have gone. They wouldn't have told you this for the 339th millionth time, that there is something that is still to be worked on. So I would listen. I mean, if they're going, let them go, because most men who leave within a very short space of time discover that the woman isn't made of cream cheese.
Is cream cheese good? Depends if you like cream cheese.
Well, there's a famous saying that we think the moon is made of cream cheese. So, it's just this incredible fantasy. We've never actually been there. And we think it's absolutely wonderful. And actually, if you go to the moon, you discover there's no atmosphere and there's nothing there. And there's nothing better guaranteed to kill the passion between the two of them when they actually have to face each other. So what I find, which is the far more destructive than wanting to leave, is what I call the yo-yos, where they go, they keep texting you to say, I'm missing you. And, now you're in the position of being the other woman. And, he's sneaking off to see you. 3 months later, he moves back in with you and you think, and guess what he's doing? He's still contacting the other woman and he's going back and forth. So, let them go and they don't come back until they're really sure. They might even have to go and live somewhere else in the meantime. Because the last thing you want, if you think it's difficult enough now with them threatening to leave, it's far worse than coming and going. That's easily the worst thing.
I have women that have that happen too. So what do you say to the midlife crisis man as you're talking about his purpose or his life goals? And he says, well, I don't know what I want.
Yeah, and that is the problem. Most people have never really asked themselves that question deep down. They're doing stuff that, their headmaster said, it would be a good idea to go into accountancy because you'll always have a job. But did they actually really want to do that? Is that actually what makes them get up in the morning? Because, they might have to do some really deep thinking. And
what happens if they spend time and they're still like, I don't know, I'm 62 years old and I don't know.
And I would think that would be a very good time to see somebody like myself and discover who you are. Rather than running around with somebody else. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That's right.
So, if there comes a point where step back, because if you're pursuing and they're running, then that's a problem. But if you step back and just give them space, many times they will come back.
Why is that?
Well,
Tell me, why do they come back?
Well, they come back because they realize that, number one, you can't solve your problems by running away. There is something valuable in the relationship and the family. Now, it might ultimately be that it is co-parents, but be good co-parents rather than him disappearing out of your son or daughter's life. That's worth working for. You work on the communication first, and then you discover what the feelings are. So if he keeps on saying, I don't love you, what's most important is actually, can we talk to each other? Can we listen? Can we negotiate about this kind of stuff?
I agree, 100%. So I asked some of the girls, I had a group call the other day, and I said, does anyone have any questions that they want me to ask you? And someone said, they're curious in your opinion, is midlife crisis, or what we have it, is it becoming more prevalent? Do you see a change in our world? Because, kids are growing up without parents. Parents are getting divorced and dad leaves the home back in the 80s. And these kids now are adults, parents, and they're not functioning as adults because they're lost.
Yeah, I think we get generation after generation of trauma. I often see several generations of trauma.
Tell me about that.
The stuff that we don't sort out, we pass on to the next generation to sort out. So, often I see generations of depressed men who are angry, depressed men who have angry, depressed children, who have more angry, depressed children, rather than actually understanding why they're angry and depressed, learning to ask for what they want and to negotiate about it rather than to demand, and when they don't get it, sulk. That sort of doesn't work. You can get generations of angry and sad women as well. People say, I don't want to be anything like my parents. My gosh, I can't tell you how much work it is not to turn into my father. It's almost like a daily struggle.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Okay, there was kind of like this technical difficulties, and I want to get back to our interview with Andrew G. Marshall, who's written a ton of books that I know you will all love. His list is exorbitant. We're going to go through them at the end. For now, Andrew, thank you for being so patient.
It's my pleasure.
It's almost comical. Okay, so I want to talk about one of your books. The reason that I actually reached out to you in the first place is the I love you, but I'm not in love with you. Can you give me and our listeners a little bit more insight to where that comes from? Why do men say that? Why do women say that? Where does that stem from?
The problem is we do things that we think is going to protect our love, and actually it's really bad for our love. So we want to keep things nice. So what do? We swallow something that really upsets us or irritates us because, look, it's only a small thing, and so I'll swallow it. But the problem is we can't switch off just the feelings that we want to switch off. We can't go into our control and say, I'll lose the anger, I'll lose the upset, I'll lose the disappointment. You actually end up switching all your feelings off. So you're suppressing the feelings to keep things nice because, lovers are not supposed to argue and fight and do all of those things. So often the people who say, I love you, but I'm not in love with you, are the ones that everybody think are great, great partners because they're doing what the other person wants all the time. And they're both doing what they think the other person wants. But actually, they're switching off bits of themselves. And you can't do that without switching off all of the feelings. And you become like flatmates. What you really need to be able to do is handle conflict. And sometimes couples are really bad at conflict. I've had plenty of people who've said, my father used to shout all the time. And I said to myself, I would never do that myself. But conflict, actually, if you know how to argue properly, is really good. Because if you have a fight, it's a way of actually, when you're angry, you say the things that you're keeping back. And for people who are suppressing their feelings, actually to say what is their truth is really important, because once you've got their truth, you can actually begin to do something about it. So that most couples that I see who've got I love you, but I'm not in love with you, are actually trying to be great partners. And they're trying so hard, they're actually creating a character rather than being themselves.
It's very interesting. What about the person that's having an affair and those words flow off their tongue? Could it be that perhaps maybe someone else is taking those feelings of love that they could have had for their wife or husband?
Well, lots of people get really upset if their partner says, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. But actually, that's a really good thing to say, because at least the problem is actually out in the open, that whether it's really going to be dealt with. Unfortunately, there are people who don't say, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. They suppress that as well. And they sort of think, well, I'll just soldier on because we work well as a team, mother and father bringing up the children, and it doesn't have to all be romance, etc., etc. So they don't actually say that. And the problem is, if you don't say, I love you, but I'm not in love with you, you actually enter into the despair stage. You can actually, because the two of you are not really talking properly, you can begin to believe all sorts of things about your partner, like they don't love you either. And then suddenly somebody comes along who you do feel strong things about, that you're interested in. And rather than saying to yourself, oops, suddenly I'm really interested in this person, danger sign, step back, they've reached despair, and very stupidly they take up the temptation. Because if you want to know about affairs, I have a formula for what happens, why affairs happen. Number one, there's a problem plus poor communication. And with I love you, but I'm not in love with you, you're keeping things nice. You're not talking about the real issues. Plus temptation. Temptation on its own is not a problem. We get temptation all the time, but we can walk past it. But if there's a deep-seated problem that hasn't been addressed, it might be a personal problem. It might be a problem in your relationship. But if you're not able to actually talk about it and sit down and sort it out, then temptation comes along. So it's horrible to hear, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. But it's much better than discovering that your partner's had an affair or is having an affair.
So, and if you get both?
If you get both, the question you're always going to ask when somebody's having an affair is why? The problem is what you're going to get is all of their justifications, what they're actually telling themselves. I think a much better question is, how could you have an affair? How are you able to look yourself in the eyes, in the mirror, and actually go ahead and do it? What you're doing then is actually hearing their personal justifications of how they did it. This is what's going on in their brain. Whereas if you ask them why, they're going to tell you these things, and you're going to think that this is, the God's honest truth. But actually, it's their affair brain. It's how they're justifying to themselves what they've done. And obviously, there is no decent justification for having an affair, but they're going to give it to you because otherwise they wouldn't be able to function.
You write a lot about midlife crisis.
Yes.
Is that something that just showed up in your office quite often that led you into that kind of field of work?
I certainly went into it via the affair because a lot of people who are going through a midlife crisis have an affair. Yes. So that's how it sort of entered into. But we can have a midlife crisis in lots and lots of different ways. I think I've already said that my first partner died. And as you can imagine, that was a huge crisis point in my life. I had to completely and utterly rethink my life. On one level, that's a very good thing to do, because the idea is we spend the first half of our life doing what society says we should do and what society says is going to give us a meaningful life. And in the second half, we actually have to work out what it is that makes our life meaningful, rather than what the Pope or what everybody else in authority tells us is the right way to live our lives. We've actually ultimately got to be true to ourselves. I learnt a huge amount about myself. My life was a pivot point. It was before and after. This crisis was not brought on by an affair. It was brought on by a death. Other people lose a job. Other people have a mental breakdown because they literally can't do their job anymore. They've been pushing themselves so hard. And other people drive the car into the wall. It would be great if people were able to reassess their lives without smashing everything up. A lot of other people whose partners had an affair, they end up in a midlife crisis. What have I done with my life? How did I get here? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? How am I going to build a new marriage that is different? That is a crisis that's happened in the middle of their lives and is also a pivot point. The idea of having this difficult middle stage of your life where you move from doing what everybody else thinks is right, getting the corner office, being the most successful salesperson in the team, you think, what is it that actually gives my life meaning? And, for me, it's writing my books. Does it bring me in much money? Not really. But there are more important things than money. That would be an example of how your orientation to the world will change and how important it is to really understand what is right for you.
Midlife crisis, how long, in your opinion, based on your teachings and your research, how long do they last?
It depends. The hope is you go into the crisis, think of it as a valley, and then you come up the other side, that you learn about yourself, you are more authentic, more real. This is a horrible thing to say, less of a sleazeball if you've been cheating, and you can look yourself in the mirror. There are lots of people that this whole thing is too painful, instead of actually building back up, because the great news is I'm 65, or actually I'm 65 in a few days' time, that once you get into your 50s and 60s, it's all jam. It's much better. 20s and 30s are really tough. It's the really difficult point. The next bit is much easier. But instead of getting that boost, bumping along the bottom, they're doing a dead cat bounce. Do you know what the dead cat bounce is?
No, tell me.
So if you drop a cat from a dead cat from a building, when it hits the floor, the idea is it will have a little bit of a bounce. It's an idea from the stock exchange. So you get a little bit of a bounce. There's nothing to be really excited about because the cat isn't alive. It's just bouncing from gravity and the impact. So they think, an affair makes them feel better for a whole 30 seconds. And, then it stops and, they start drinking and that they feel better for like 15 seconds after that, and they just end up being sad, bitter and twisted, won't get fooled again, sort of kind of thing. So it doesn't automatically mean they're going to get out of it. They could just end up with being bitter old men or bitter old women. You don't necessarily come out the other side and see the light. You've got to do the work. You've got to do the work of who am I, what makes my life meaningful, and what are my values rather than the values of my parents, the president, or, as I say, the Pope. You've got to
what
think
do you
about...
say to someone in your office if you ask them, well, what is your purpose? And they go, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you ask them, what do you value? And they go, I don't know.
Well, that's the beginning of the work. It's not a pop quiz. Actually finding what makes your life meaningful, which is what my podcast is all about, is a long-term project, and it's going to change over time. It could be, for example, being a mother is the most meaningful thing to you, but your children go off to university, and
That's right.
It could be that there's something else is going to be the thing that's going to make your life more meaningful now. It might be time for you to learn about yourself and to put yourself first and to do the things that you haven't been able to do. It's something that changes. Yes, being a mother is still going to be incredibly important to you, but maybe there are other things that are meaningful.
Do you think midlife crises are getting more prominent now, or has it always been there? We just never talked about it.
I think that our grandparents' generation were much more the sort of suck it up and just be old, bitter and twisted.
Spoken like an Englishman.
Well, we're very good at have you ever heard of the British stiff upper lip?
Yes.
We're very good at that.
Yes. Even when you're angry, you're not angry.
Yes. What would be called by Thoreau a life of quiet desperation. We're more prepared to drive the car straight against the wall now. And it would be really wonderful if we could find a middle way.
Do you think parents today could do anything to their children so they don't face something like that?
Yes and no. No, because it's their children's point to learn and grow, and your job is just to launch them. If you're trying to manage your child's life, they've got to make their own mistakes and they've got to learn for themselves. I think that we put a lot of pressure on our children to be what we want them to be. So we want them to succeed. My parents wanted me not to talk about emotions and feelings. Well, you can see how well that went. I came from a family where we don't talk about feelings. Can you imagine what a shock it was to have to deal with bereavement? Because, your feelings come up every day and slap you round the face. You can't ignore them. I think giving your children a chance to be themselves rather than what we think is best for them is a pretty good start.
Do you think the midlife crisis, that if one family went through an affair and had this tragedy and a child witnessed that, what are the probabilities that you think that might happen again?
Well, everything that I certainly believe in inherited trauma, but it could be equally that you could end up teaching your children all sorts of important things, which is when there's a problem, we sit tight and face it and do something about it. You could teach them about forgiveness. You could teach them about how people can change and be better. I think the problem comes when all of these things are not talked about, when it's all secrets and lies. That's the difficult part of it.
In a situation where, let's say, there's a wife and a husband, and the wife knows the husband's having the affair, and the husband wants to get together with the kids and say, Mom and I are getting divorced because we want a divorce, and the wife is like, no, I don't. How, should the wife back the husband and say, we're getting a divorce and we're going to be okay? Or should she come clean and say, yeah, your dad had an affair and he's leaving with a 20-year-old. Is that something that we should be honest about, or should we be more careful, or what do you think?
Well, I think the children are going to find this information out for themselves very quickly, aren't they? I mean, I think the problem is not the facts. The problem is the commentary that goes along with it. Children can actually see stuff for themselves. I mean, the number one choice is to actually tell these things together, but you don't badmouth your partner. You say, he's leaving me and he's got somebody else. You can't hide this information. They will find out. They're not... what are your children? Blind, dumb and stupid? They've got eyes of their own. Children know far more than you imagine. They spend all their lives watching their parents. They know they've got a pretty good idea what is going on. And it's more upsetting for you to be trying to pretend. You don't have to give them a blow-by-blow account. They don't have to be mommy or daddy's little helper.
What's the biggest struggle you see with the partner who's facing someone who's going through a crisis? Is there any advice you would give to the partner?
Well, the first thing I would want to do is give them a huge, great big hug, because, you're being tested to the very end. The next thing I would say would get yourself some support. The third thing is don't believe everything you're being told, because everybody's got to be the hero of their own lives. Inside their head, they've got this story just because this is the story they're telling themselves. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your breath trying to knock it back. Just say, I see things differently, because otherwise you're just debating with each other. Generally, I would say if he's determined to leave, it's probably better to let him leave, because he is going to then find out she's not made of green cheese.
Is green cheese good?
Well, we used to think when we were kids the moon was made of green cheese. That was the, so, it's just this wonderful, wonderful thing that, she's all that. And I'll let you into a little secret. She's not. Basically, if you're having an affair, you're in a desperate place. And if you're prepared to have an affair with a married man, particularly a married man with children, you've got to be in a pretty desperate place yourself. And two desperate people are going to make a desperate relationship. If you are perceived as the wicked witch of the East, step back and let them get on with it, because before very long, they're not going to be fighting with you. They're going to be fighting with each other.
So true. You say it so eloquently with your accent. It's just like butter. It's so perfect.
Butter and cream cheese.
And the green cheese too. No, it's beautiful. I love your accent. I could actually fall asleep. Do you have sleep videos as well? Your voice is just so calming.
Well, you could listen to my podcasts, and I do have a podcast on how to sleep better. So there is one on that topic if you'd like.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, I need a link for that. I'll put it in the notes as well. Oh, you were talking about in our last call that we had, you were talking about a drama triangle. Can you tell me about that?
The drama triangle is at the very core of what's happening with infidelity. And it happens often when there's drama in a relationship and maybe in your childhood. So there are three places in this triangle. One of them is the victim. So think of a triangle, and this one's at the bottom. Top right-hand corner is rescuer, and top left-hand corner is perpetrator. Let's say your partner is having an affair, so he will see himself as the victim of this terrible situation, and his affair partner is the rescuer who's come along, and you are the perpetrator, that cruel, evil person that's driven him to this.
The witch.
you're the witch in that section. Well, for you, you're going to feel like you're the victim. You're waiting for your partner to rescue you from the perpetrator, who's that word which begins with a B. I can see your eyes taking a couple of seconds to get there.
I got there.
And you can see for the other woman, the fancy piece. There we are. Let's call her the fancy piece. That's what my grandmother used to call. Used to use the phrase she used to use. She would say, "Oh, he's got his fancy piece."
Oh, I call them horse faces.
I think fancy piece is a little nicer. Anyway,
it's British. It's very eloquent.
So for the fancy piece, they're the victim. Your
Yes.
husband is the rescuer, and you're the perpetrator who's keeping them from happiness ever after. Hopefully, the other person will be out of the picture, and it's just the three of you. But you're forever going round this circle. Or this triangle, because triangles are incredibly powerful. You know, you're in a really bad place because you're remembering all the details of something that happened and you're really upset. He tries to rescue you, either fails or actually begins to feel that you have moved into the perpetrator position because you're getting angry with him. And then he's feeling as if he's in the victim place. You can keep on going round this triangle all the time, and triangles are the most powerful thing. It's what they build bridges out of because it can take a lot of stress. So what you have to do is you have to move from the drama triangle into the winner's triangle, and all the positions in the winner's triangle are great. And so what I'm trying to say with this is there's a great temptation. He's in a crisis, he doesn't know what to do, he's miserable. You are going to try and rescue him from all of this. But if you go into the rescuing place, which we think is a good place to be, we're just still in the triangle. You have to go into the winner's triangle. What's the place in the winner's triangle is just listening. So you don't rescue, you just listen. So, he says, "Oh, it's the end of the world. I'm never going to get over this. My life is a pile of poo, etc., etc." And, the temptation is, of course, to rescue and say, "No, it isn't. Look, you've got this lovely family and I love you." And that doesn't work. You just have to listen. So you go, tell me more. You can summarize what he's just said. So, everything's turned to poo and, you feel entirely hopeless. And what often tends to happen is he will begin to talk round and say, well, actually, it's not as bad as that after all. And if he feels really listened to, then that is a very good place to be in. So instead of perpetrating, you need to be going into the place there is called negotiating. So instead of saying, this is what we're going to do, say, we're going to open a negotiation. In negotiation, I can ask, you can say no, and we can negotiate. And in the bottom place, you've got to, which is the victim place, you've got to actually be open and problem solving. What happens when we're in the victim place? We're in one of two things. We're either curled up in a ball saying, don't hit me, so we're incredibly closed off, or we're closed off in another way saying, I'm leaving, nobody's ever going to hurt me, I'm going to take my ball and I'm going home. So we're in those sort of two positions. We're either, don't hurt me, or I'm going to get a divorce. Whereas if we're actually open, we're prepared to talk about everything, we're prepared to listen, negotiate, we're out of this drama triangle of forever going around victim, rescuer and perpetrator. Because if we're open, we're not a victim. We've got power, we've got strength, we're an adult, not a small child.
What book is this in?
It's in two places. It's in my book, Wake Up and Change Your Life, and I have a course that if you go to my website, it's called My Best Relationship Tools. And I go into this in huge detail. I go through the listening exercises, how to reflect back. I gave it to you in 30 seconds. I've got another one, which is a parent, adult, child, so that you don't get into that particular dynamic where you're either the nurturing parent or the critical parent, and they're the rebellious child, that you can talk to each other, adult to adult. I mean, these things are like gold dust after an affair. I go through them. I've got 4 hours worth of video lectures. I go through and there's worksheets and everything else like that. So,
Okay, send me a link to that and I'll put that in the notes as well.
yeah.
A lot of women tend to, especially when a man's going through something struggling, and vice versa, they turn into their mother.
I mean, that's rescuing, isn't it? I mean, I have to tell you, it's the least attractive thing a woman can be.
How does she stop? Like in it, like a couple nuggets. Like, give me a nugget.
Well, number one is you've got to stop seeing him as a child. I mean, I can't tell you how many wives say I've got 3 children, and well, now actually 4 if you count my husband.
I said that in stand up. Though I used to do stand up 100 years ago.
Yeah, and so first of all, you've got to wipe that idea from your brain. You have to meet adult to adult is problem solving. How are we going to deal with this? Why have we got into this particular place? It's the skills I've just beginning to tell you about: listening, negotiating. You know, parents say you will do this, or why won't you do this? Darling, let me sort it out. I'll make it all better. You know, that if you give an invitation to being an adult, you know, most people say, what's the matter? Oh, you're not interested. Yes, I am. Whereas a critical parent will be, why do you think I'm not interested? You know, considering all the things you've done, no wonder they're going to respond as rebellious child or sulky child or tantrum child, etc., etc.
Interesting.
That is so like 45 minutes cut down into 30 seconds. So
yeah, I figured that. But I wanted you to give a little taste so people would know what that was about. So in your opinion, I have women who say to me, why should I even do this? Is it even worth it? Maybe I should just leave him. In your opinion, when someone's been married 20 years, what's the reason to keep going?
Well, I think if you want to leave the relationship, that this is actually being seriously harmful for your mental health, you know what's best for you. Please do leave. If that's just how you're feeling when you're in despair or when you're feeling like a victim, it's like this is a 30-second solution. What I always say is focus on improving the communication between the two of you. Don't try and solve the problem. Get to the point that you can really have good conversations. You can listen to each other. You can hear his stuff. He can hear your stuff. And as I say, you can begin to negotiate and find different ways of doing things. Good communication is never wasted, because if you do end up getting a divorce, you're going to need to be able to communicate even better, because considering how often you can misunderstand each other speaking face to face in your own kitchen, just imagine how difficult it's going to be over text when they're in a different kitchen. Good communication skills are never wasted, because it could help you be great parents together. So I would say focus on the communication skills, see if that can improve, because it's never wasted. Then when you can communicate better, maybe you can decide together what the best thing to do is. That's always my goal, is we don't focus on, shall we stay or shall we go? Let's just focus on improving the communication skills, the day-to-day stuff. And then when we can actually talk properly, we can actually begin to excavate what has gone wrong.
That's a great way of looking at it. Do you think people could fall out of love because they're having an affair could fall back into love? Is that possible?
Yes, of course.
What could you say to encourage that?
I think that it's often very good to actually, if you're the person who's still in love, to actually look at that love and actually challenge it a little bit, to see the bits that aren't working for you, because it's a much better way to say, the things in the relationship aren't working for me too, that I would like to change, rather than trying to sell yourself to them, because nobody wants to be sold to, they want to buy. There are things that actually you need to be different too. What are those things? What's actually going to help you open up more? Because generally, if things have got to this stage, you're going to be pretty closed off, angry and hurt, and you need to get to the point where you can actually open your heart back up again. If you're focusing on learning to patch up and to reopen your heart, I think that that's quite a good role model for your partner, to look down deeper and open their heart. When there's a problem and people are stuck, generally, guess what I do?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, what I do when people are stuck is I go deeper, and by that I mean that we try and connect back onto a deeper level. Let's Let's try and improve the connection sexually. Let's try and excavate some of the pain that hasn't actually been dealt with, because this is the most wonderful thing about affairs, because there has to be one good thing about affairs. So let me tell you what it is. The people who arrive in my office the most upset are the people who've had affairs, or their partner's had an affair. Who are the people that leave the happiest? The people where there's been infidelity. And the reason is most couples, want to patch up their relationship, and they don't want to go into the nasty corners where, she earns more than him and he doesn't like her mother. They don't go into those places. The great news is once there's been infidelity, you want to have a complete spring clean. You do want to go into those corners. You do want to sort those things out. You go deeper, and that work, which takes time, is what allows you to connect again. The great problem is when we're hurting, our initial reaction is to run and get away from that as quickly as possible. We want to get the exit as quickly as possible. We want the, for want of a better word, the easy way out. All you end up doing is you solve the problem in the fact that you're separated, but the issues between the two of you are still there and still need to be sorted out, and they get played out through fights about who's going to have the children at Easter instead. So it's worth going deeper. It's worth doing the work.
We've covered a lot, and you have been amazing, and I know my people are going to love this. I do want to share, I'm going to list the links to these books below in the notes for everybody, but just to talk about these really quickly. I Love You, But I'm Not in Love with You. Amazing. That was the first book I ever read years ago. It's not a midlife crisis. It's an opportunity. Love that. Can we start again, please? Love that too. What is love? 50 questions. Wake up and change your life. We talked about that. Learn to love yourself enough. I have a lot of women who discover this when their husband leaves and they can't even breathe. This is an excellent book for them. Have the Sex You Want. Oh, that's just amazing. I love that. I'll have to read that one soon. My Husband Doesn't Love Me. He's texting someone else.
Yeah, that's happens in two halves.
Is it?
The first part is, he doesn't love you anymore and there's not another woman. And then the second half is, that there is somebody who he's texting / having an affair with.
So that's just a few of the amazing books you've written, and I'm just in awe of how much content you have that could touch all of my followers and listeners as well. So I will definitely leave these at the bottom.
Listen to my podcast as well, because I go into lots of things that are really important. So I mean, just the current edition is about grief, and that there is a lot of a grief when the marriage you thought you had, you'd suddenly discover that you haven't, and there's you need to grieve that. And I think the word grief gives dignity to all the feelings that you're having, and we go through the stages of dealing with loss. So these things are really useful, that sometimes looking at the problems not just through the infidelity lens, but looking at through the human lens actually gives you some fresh perspectives and doesn't actually get you crawling into scratching the same wound over and over again. It gives you another way of approaching the pain. So do listen to my podcast. I would
Excellent. So you're going to send me the links. I just need to listen to a podcast as well as to the course if anyone wants to sign up for that as well. Andrew, I know you have things to do. You've been amazing and so patient through all of these little trials and tribulations we've had with Mr. Electricity. Thank you. You're wonderful. And I God bless you, and thank you for all the work you're doing. I'm sure you're helping lots of people.
And thank you for the work you're doing as well, Laurie.
Thank you, honey.